So let's talk about starting an army of the Emperor's own Golden Legion, with an overview of getting a shield host together and collecting Adeptus Custodes. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes once more, and in this video I thought I'd do an update on the start collecting video for the faction, now there's a new codex out and about. In the video I thought we'd talk through why you might want to collect Adeptus Custodes in the first place, some things to think about when planning an army, a few ideas for first miniature purchases, and a focus on some of the core kits of the faction, and then round up talking about a few rules and one example army list. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. In Warhammer 40K, the Adeptus Custodes are essentially the Emperor's own legion, superior beings to Space Marines in just about every way, as far apart from an Astartes as an Astartes is from a normal human, such as the arcane genetic alchemy employed in their construction. Every soldier is basically a hero in their own right, not just a warrior but a thinker and craftsman as well, and their typical role is to act as the dread guardians of holy terror, protecting the Emperor from any xenos, chaos, or treacherous threat that might choose to attempt to harm the master of mankind. The Custodes typically choose to fight as small heavily armed forces of elite infantry and dreadnoughts with arcane artisan technology, the Throne of Terror often having preserved a few of the greatest secrets for itself over the Mechanicum of Mars. Their shield lines stalk forward armed with guardian spears and clad in the finest Auramite armour. In the Indomitus era, Rebruted Guilliman has directed the Custodes to take a more pragmatic view to their defence of the throne world, often being dispatched on first strikes to end a major threat to the Emperor and Terror before it has even manifested, so maybe a little bit more likely to be abroad in the wider galaxy than they were before. To face the 10,000 in battle is to likely lose. They're pretty much the most famed and feared fighting force in the Imperium. Miniatures-wise, the Adeptus Custodes have quite a small range. They were launched as their own army in 8th edition Warhammer 40k, and the bulk of their army consists around 5 main plastic kits, plus a few character miniatures, and a couple more generic Space Marine support options like the Land Raider. In general, their range is quite a nice one, I think. They're all really quite nice recent sculpts, with pretty detailed and chunky models, and they hold up well to current 40k standards. Custodes are maybe a bit of a weird case in armies in Warhammer 40k though. They're perhaps more reliant on their Forge World range than most other armies in the game, and it is pretty integral if you want to have a bit more of a balanced force, say with some big tanks and big themed dreadnoughts to balance out, and they're made in far more expensive resin miniatures that perhaps aren't quite as nice to work with for newer folks. Eventually they'll likely redo some of this in plastic I suspect, but it could be quite a long way out at this point, and even then it might be more aimed for the Horus Heresy setting compared with contemporary 40k. In general, if you're collecting Custodes, you're just going to have a few really quite elite miniatures compared with many other factions, and hyper elite forces do have some advantages. They tend to be quick to paint, easy to transport, and cost a bit less overall. Taking a look at some of their models, here on the left we have the foot troops of the Custodes, the Custodian Guard, big chunky elite infantry with massive armour and outsized power weapons, much of their armour plate stylized to be like the Imperial Eagles. On the right we have the Allos Custodian Terminators, even bigger armour and can redeploy in golden light. Here we've got the Dawn Eagle jet bikes of the Virtus Praetors, quite fun jet models with lances I think, a bit of hard-hitting fast attack for the Custodes, and they often fight hand in hand with the Sisters of Silence, the other talent of the Emperor that specialise in laying psychers low. The Null Maiden's innate gifts rendering enemy psychers and witches worthless before putting them to the torch with Flamer or Bolter. For the character miniatures, here we have Captain General Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes on the left. He's a High Lord of Terror and a bit of a beast in close combat, and one of their more recent miniatures is a Champion miniature for the Custodes. The Blade Champion fights with Volt Swords, and is a combatant to tangle with at your peril. Here are just a couple of examples from the extensive Custodes Forge World range. On the left here we have some jump infantry in the Venatari Custodians, a fast-moving assault force that strikes from the sky like a thunderbolt. And here we have one of their 3 unique dreadnoughts in the Contemptor Achilles, really quite a cool dreadnought I think, fighting with essentially a massive guardian spear. I do like the stylized eagle armor plating on the model as well. One of the main draws to collecting Adeptus Custodes is the cheap pricing. At time of recording they are arguably the single cheapest army to get into Warhammer 40k with, and it is perhaps somewhat ironic given their tendency for being hyper valuable models in game and their liking for gold. That only really holds true of their non-Sister of Silence plastic kits though. If you go heavy on these Sisters of Silence and their Forge World models, that's not going to be quite as true, but for the most part they have really quite good points per dollar ratios in their units, It's perhaps further helped out that a lot of their box sets allow you to build shield captain leaders from the squads themselves. Often characters can be a fairly expensive part of a Warhammer 40k range. Gameplay-wise, the Adeptus Custodes are realised by Codex Adeptus Custodes. Classically, they tend to fight as a heavily armoured infantry battle line with some strong melee from Guardian Spears, and their core rule plays into that in the Martial Qatar, getting to choose between two different stances each time they fight, one for fighting heavies and one for fighting light troops. They have 4 different detachments, all a little bit different in theming. Maybe some are a touch better executed than others, as we'll get on to, and they tend to be very, very elite. Big 2+ armor saves, 4+ invulnerable saves, and generally hitting on a 2+. Each soldier can definitely have stat lines to rival those of certain heroes from other armies. Usually they tend to want to move towards the mid-board objectives and dominate the midfield with their tanky stat lines and dare the foe to come and fight them with their good melee. And as it goes in Warhammer 40k, they're a fairly easy army to play, generally tend to do well casually when they're balanced, but can maybe be a little bit simplistic. Though there's plenty of reward for good positioning inboard, as always, maybe a little bit less scope for really big clever tricks versus a few other armies. In-game power-wise, pre-codex they were very, very strong indeed, though it looks like the codex for the most part has given them some nerfs. It looks like they might well flip back to being one of the weaker armies of 40k, unless Games Workshop compensate with points reductions or rules errata. While we're on the subject of the codex, it's worth mentioning that it wasn't well received at launch. While I'd argue the core of the faction rules remain intact, it was criticised as many as just being a bit of a downgrade compared with the Index army that came before in 40k. Overall, either weaker or less interesting rules, both in the core rule, the unit datasheets, and the detachment rules, which isn't exactly very exciting. Given their history with balanced data slates, I'm sure they'll eventually get around to making sure the Custodes are a strong army again if they do wind up being weak. In general, the fortunes of 40k factions do tend to wax and wane in quite a big way. Pre-Codex, the Custodes had already been right at the very top of 40k, then right at the bottom, then straight back to the top again. I will also mention that there was a bit of an outcry from a good portion of the player base about them retconning female custodians into the lore, which weren't a thing before. I think it's worth acknowledging as something that's really stirred up the player base, but I feel like it'd be quite nice if we can manage not to turn this video's comment section into another ranting section about that. I just don't think that whole debate is going to be the most helpful thing for newer players out there, and there's plenty of places to discuss that elsewhere. In any case though, a rocky codex release aside, the Adeptus Custodes remain a really cool army in Warhammer 40k I think. Cool guardians of Holy Terror with thick Auramite armor, and hyper elite infantry with Guardian Spears, and also being one of the cheapest armies to collect in Warhammer 40k certainly doesn't hurt them. If you do choose to collect an Adeptus Custodes army, there are plenty of places that you can do to go for a little research. Codex Adeptus Custodes is maybe one of the easier places to start for a completely newer player. It does have all the unit profiles in and rules from Games Workshop, so it can give you a better grasp as to how the army fits together and how you'll play the units in game. You can mess around with army building with things like Battlescribe, New Recruit, Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app. You can potentially try before you buy a little bit by proxying models or using Tabletop Simulator if you're into that. And of course there's plenty of content here on YouTube as well. I made a Custodes Codex overview, and I'll be aiming to make a unit tier list and review a few more army lists on the channel in the coming weeks. Otherwise, on other channels, there's battle reports, painting guides, and all sorts of lore out there. Not hard to find some good Custodes content, and you might well want to check out their social media as well. Discord servers, Facebook groups, and subreddits exist for pretty much all the major Warhammer 40k factions. Can just be an interesting enough place to get a grip of what the Custodes community is talking about, get some painting inspiration, and ask a few basic questions to experienced hobbyists if you're new to the game. Otherwise, you could then think about planning an army list. It could be worth drafting out a rough 1000 point or 2000 point army list just to get you some sort of idea as to the models that you could be looking at for an army of any given size, maybe using Battlescribe, New Recruit, or Warhammer's app. I'd say that due to their smallish army range, the Adeptus Custodes might generally tend to at least look fairly similar from one collection to the next. You're pretty likely to be having at least a fair bunch of their elite infantry, Custodian Guard, the Terminators, and the Wardens as the core of your army. I feel like the majority of Custodes players generally tend to collect at least fairly balanced. Perhaps one of the bigger decisions is how heavy you're going to go onto the Forge World unit side of the range. As mentioned, it's really quite a lot more expensive, though there are some pretty fun sculpts out there. It does give you access to things like the Caladius tanks for a bit of long-range anti-tank punch. I do quite like the Dreadnought miniatures, they do look rather cool. Otherwise, you can decide how many Sisters of Silence you want in the army and how many. I'd say they're kind of handy enough to have around in game. and do fight with them in the lore as the Talons of the Emperor. I feel like not every Custodes player necessarily wants to have them in the Force though, if they're collecting Custodes as opposed to the Talons Force. Otherwise, for slight different takes, you could use a Land Raider if you wanted, or go bike heavy in an army. You could take allies if you'd like, such as some assassins, an Inquisitor, or maybe a big Imperial Knight if you wanted. Or you could just take one detachment out of the codex and decide that you're really going to try and build around that and take the choices that would make most sense there, like maybe going character heavy in Auric Champions, I guess. Speaking of which, the 4 detachments in the Adeptus Custodes are the Talons of the Emperor, Shield Host, Maiden Vigil, and Auric Champions. They do follow slightly different themes. The Talons of the Emperor basically consisted of Silence plus Custodes, with the Custodes getting better rules and more efficient stratagems next to them. Would mean that at least you want a bit of a mix of the two. I'd say it might be looking like perhaps the strongest of the detachments at first impressions. The Shield Host is the more core Custodes battle line, buffs and abilities focused around the Custodes themselves. The Maiden Vigil is the Sisters of Silence detachment, and the Auric Champions is focused on the Custodes characters. For most people's first impressions of the Codex, both the Maiden Vigil and Auric Champions seem to be quite vastly underpowered compared with the others. Both of them just don't really give you any real supports to your actual core Custodes units. All the things that help you out are either focused on the Sisters that tend to struggle to cover the damage of the army, or on the characters, which are good, but maybe aren't enough to carry the army on their own. You could also maybe collect an army from the lore and go around one of the shield hosts for the Adeptus Custodes. There's a fair few of them that are being fleshed out a little bit, all with slightly different heraldry, maybe different cloth colours like the purple of the Aquilan shield or the white armour of the Solar Watch. These are more for lore and theming in-game. In general, it's one of the ideas of 10th edition that paint scheme doesn't really determine your rules, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Speaking of paint, that's another thing to work out about planning an army, what sort of colour scheme that you're going for, and painting up a test model. I'd likely be tempted to use a standard Custodian Guard as a good start to the army. They're pretty representative of what you get in the faction overall, and maybe a little bit less big investment than a bike or a character or similar. Even if every Custodian is a big chunky model, it's probably best to make mistakes or redo one of the line infantry as opposed to one of the centerpieces, I think. In general, I'd rate Custodes as at least fairly easy to paint up. If you do just literally want an army on the board fast, you can get that really quite quickly. A gold spray paint and some nice use of some wash for the recesses, maybe a dry brush to highlight after that, can get the vast majority of the armour looking really quite nice. Then just pick out details with power weapons, crests and things like that. There are tons of good painting guides online and here on YouTube, lots of ways to execute gold in Warhammer 40k and make them look nice. Games Workshop themselves do have quite a few, but there's loads more from other creators doing all sorts of different ways to get some nice paint schemes on your models. And while a lot of people do go for the iconic Custodes gold, you can certainly shake it up and make your own shield host colours if you like. No one's going to be disappointed to see Custodes painted up in a cool and unusual way. Moving on to the exciting bit though, let's talk miniatures. The Custodes range, as mentioned, isn't the hugest. Personally, I'd probably start with one of the Combat Patrol box sets. Either the old one or the new one is good. Otherwise, maybe just a standard kit of Custodian Guard if you just want to dip a toe in the faction, and try a few models with a little bit less investment than one of the big boxes. Otherwise, there have been some past discount sets as well, such as the recent Auric Champions, or previous Boarding Patrols or Christmas Battle Force boxes. If you can find one of those for some sort of semblance of its original price, it's not the worst option either. This is the fairly recently released Custodes Combat Patrol for 10th edition, and is generally considered to be perhaps the single best Combat Patrol box set that they've released in 10th edition so far. You get really quite a lot of points on the board out of this, and a lot of chunky golden boys. The box comes with a Blade Champion, 5 Custodian Guard, 3 Alaris Terminators, and 5 Custodian Wardens. You get around about 800 points of models in the box, which is just vastly more than other factions, and you can even get more than that if you build one or more as a shield captain. The Custodes kits do have the option of that in their line infantry squads. Overall, it's a pretty good one. Custodes units at a 30% discount, and you could easily get multiple copies of this to fill out the core infantry segment of your army besides adding other stuff. Maybe the only slight downside is multiple copies of the Blade Champion, though at least pre-codex I had seen plenty of lists running more than one copy of him. It can be a nice way to deliver Custodes into melee and fight very hard when you get there. Otherwise, the previous Combat Patrol box set that you might still see around in different places is this one. The previous set had 3 Virtus Praetors, 5 Custodian Guard, and 10 Sisters of Silence. Not quite as many points in the box set compared with the new one, Though again, it's 3 of the Custodes' more mainline kits, and does come with quite a lot of sisters if you wanted them as an element in the army. Again, really quite a reasonable pickup, and the 2 combat patrol boxes work really well together. Between the 2 you get really quite a rounded little force. These aren't on sale from Games Workshop directly any longer, you'd have to try and find them either online or from a local discount retailer. Otherwise, just for general points on buying Warhammer 40k miniatures, bear in mind the different ways in which you can do so. For the currently sold kits with their start collecting boxes, plus their more mainline kits, Games Workshop does tend to be the most reliable, but also the most expensive. The Warhammer web store is often the first place that a lot of newer people go, though I'd certainly recommend checking out local discount retailers wherever you are in the world, either physical shops or ordering online. I generally tend to buy the vast majority of my models via discount retailers online, official resellers that get to sell at around about 10 or 20% off Games Workshop's prices. I do have a few examples of those links down in the video description if it's helpful for you. There's Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off plus their loyalty program, and 15% off with Wargame Portal in the USA. Those are affiliate links down in the video description, though if you buy anything through them you do save money versus Games Workshop, and it doesn't cost you any more for using the links at all. Can just be a way to help support Auspex Tactics if you were thinking about picking up some miniatures anyway. Otherwise though, that's certainly not the end of it. The second-hand market can definitely be worth a look. Custodes are a popular army and you often see miniatures for them being sold on eBay. Quality can be a bit variable, but potentially can save you really quite a lot of money and time and effort as well. You could have a big force of golden boys ready to go in the not too distant future. Otherwise, in this day and age, you might look at 3D printing and third-party manufacturers as well. Lots of pretty great sculpts exist outside of Games Workshop, and it's not too uncommon for people to try and make near proxies for 40k miniatures, which can be pretty handy for getting your hands on certain things. For the Custodes in particular, it is one option that seems to be quite widely embraced for near proxies for the Forge World ranges. I feel like as plastic miniatures go, the Custodes range is some of the best deals that Games Workshop tend to do from themselves, and the Forge World are some of the worst, so it's maybe an area that people particularly look to seek alternative options to economise. Otherwise, running through their kits slightly, first up we have the Custodian Guard. You can get these in the Combat Patrol, which is probably the place that I'd generally go for them first. They've got the option of Guardian Spears or Shields and Swords. I'd probably rate the Guardian Spears over the Shields and Swords a little bit, though both are usable. Sometimes it can just be handy to have one shield in the unit to tank, say, damage 3 shooting on it, and often that gets paired with a Vexilla, so you have one guy with a Vexilla shield and Misericordia to help out with objective control, and also you don't really lose out as much on its attacks from taking the shield. The box set does give you the option to build a shield captain as well. I'll probably build one of them early from one of the first few ones. Currently in 10th edition the Guardian Spear is the way to go. You could think about magnetising him, and it might well be worth thinking about converting one Custodian captain out of the box set. If you have a spare melter gun lying around, then you could make the loadout that has the Pyrothite Spear plus the shield. That's probably the optimal loadout for them post codex, and you can get that really quite easily with a simple conversion and kit bash, as opposed to buying the new one if you want. Otherwise, for Custodes that are even more elite than the standard guard, we've got the Wardens and the Alloys Terminator Custodians. Again, for the most part, Guardian Spears tend to be favoured over Axes currently in game. The math just works out a bit better against the vast majority of targets. The Vexilla is basically an auto-include for the Wardens, as you don't pass up any of the Guardian Spear or Axe attacks you might have, but it's probably not really worth it quite so much on the Alloys. You don't have that many models in the squad, and losing one's entire melee damage output bar Misericordia is a bit depressing. Again, you can get both of these within the Combat Patrol box set. If you want more, it's probably worth getting more Combat Patrol box sets in my opinion, versus buying them individually. Otherwise, we've got the Dawn Eagle jet bikes of the Virtus Praetors, a bit of fast movement for the Custodes, which often tend to be kind of slow. These guys have been monstrously strong in past editions, though in 10th edition so far they have been kind of tame for their points relative to the rest of the codex. This definitely could change in the future though. Games Workshop absolutely can and does rebalance points. I wouldn't be put off by them by temporarily underwhelming rules. I've got no doubt they'll cycle back to being strong at some point in the future. Plus I do quite like the Eagle Bite miniatures myself. I feel like the sculpted prow of those is rather fun, and I do like the big lances as well. For my own ones of these, I magnetise the bases so you can take the bikers on and off the stems for them. You probably want to find some sort of way to stop them snapping off, so don't just glue them in place. And I'd be kind of tempted to model the lances sort of angled downwards in a charging sort of pose, as much for transport as anything else, as transporting a bike with a Guardian Spear proing all the way out the top like that can be a bit of a nightmare. Finally, for their more mainline kits, we have the Sisters of Silence. They can build the Bolted Prosecutors, Flamer Witch Seekers, or these Great Blade Vigilators you can see here. As mentioned, I feel like in general, having at least a few of these along will generally make an army list stronger. It's just quite nice to have cheap units that don't have the massive investment of elite Custodes to be able to do some grunt work like certain actions, screening, or even holding down a home objective if the opponent can't reach them. I would consider their kits really quite expensive for what it is, £35 for 5 models. Previously, the best way to get them was for copies of the Custodes Combat Patrol box set, though they won't be present in that now. I'd be most tempted by the Prosecutors or Witch Seekers, unless you're going for some sort of big fun damage combo with the Vigilators, maybe protecting them from enemy shooting with that stratagem in Talons of the Emperor. Finally, for Forge World stuff, I'd still say they certainly have some cool sculpts. Maybe if you were to look at any one model, the Caladius Grav Tank might not be the worst. That does operate in a genuinely quite different way versus the rest of the army. Big hitting anti-tank firepower from a long range with good Custodes accuracy. I feel like it more than anything really does something that the rest of the army doesn't, and could be nice to have along. Otherwise, they do just have some very nice sculpts for things like their dreadnoughts. I like both this Telemon Heavy Dreadnought and the Contemptor Galators and Contemptor Achilles. Plus, there's plenty of other flavours of Forge World infantry as well. These ones will set you back quite a lot more though. Forge World models often tend to get their price inflated by something like around about 50% to double what they would have cost from Games Workshop. It's not like Plastic Warhammer is renowned around for being super cheap or anything. Finally, probably worth mentioning the Auric Champions box set that Games Workshop came out with the launch of 10th edition. If you can get this one at or near its original price, it's worth considering. 6 Terminators, 6 Bikers, 5 Wardens, and the new Shield Captain sculpt with the Melter Spear. It does give you a better discount versus either Combat Patrol at around about 40% off, more or less, and it is like 1200 points worth of Custodes in the box, even if you don't build any further Shield Captains. Pretty great by normal 40k standards. Kind of depends if you want the unit mix versus the Combat Patrol ones though. If you're just starting out, you might want a little bit more weight on the Custodian Guard, and then just add in Bikers when you need them. I think it would be very reasonable just to pass this one up and get multiple copies of the Combat Patrol box instead, though this is definitely another option and could be right if you want a lot of bikes. Overall, those would be the main ways that I consider expanding the army. I bear in mind that in Warhammer 40k there's always lots of scope for just collecting what you like the look of. 40k rules do change over time with various balance updates, and most of the core plastic kits for a faction do tend to regularly cycle around to get good again. Pre-codex at least, the mainstay of a standard Custodes balanced competitive army would generally have been building around the Custodian Guard, Wardens, and Terminators, backed up by a few characters like Trajan Valoris and the Blade Champion, and then with some Sisters of Silence to support for objective grabbing, maybe a few things like a Calidus Assassin or Kyria Draxus as allies. Summing up what we've talked about on the last few slides, I generally want to start with a value box to get the core of your force down, likely the new Combat Patrol, and you could get more than one if you wanted, then add in some Sisters of Silence for the objective grabbing, maybe a few bikes just to round out a force even if they haven't been considered great in game. I'd quite like to pick up a copy of Trajan Valoris as the faction leader, really quite a fun model and very dangerous even if his rules were nerfed. And then beyond that, there's a lot of different ways that you could go, but you don't necessarily have to. You could maybe get a Land Raider to transport them into battle. You could dip into their Forge World lineup for anything that you think is cool enough to outweigh the price tag. And as mentioned, a few Imperial allies can help. Calidus Assassins can jump around the board doing secondary objectives at the time of recording, which is handy. And Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus pairs weirdly well with Custodian Guard, their double shooting and reroll rules, just giving her absolutely savage shooting output. Perhaps a notably underpowered thing is, at the moment, the Contemptor Dreadnought, the Forge World Dreadnoughts, and much of the rest of the Forge World range is a bit meh. There's no guarantee they couldn't change things around with future points updates though. In general, my aim would be to have a rough idea for a 2000 point army list and work towards it, playing games and adapting as you go when you know what you like and what works. Finally, when you are getting games on the table, I thought I'd just talk briefly about rules. The army rule is Martial Qatar for some big damage boosts with Decatari or Rendax stance. You generally want to use Decatari normally if you are wounding on a 4+ or better, and then the lethal hits from Rendax on a 5+ or worse. Sisters of Silence don't get this. A Shield Captain can get you a single turn of both at once, and just in general, it's a fairly nice damage boost rule. that you can pick per unit when you fight. You don't have to select them for the entire army anymore. Otherwise, for the detachments, the Talons of the Emperor is quite good. The core rule gives you a little bit of defense against mortal wounds, which is one of the better ways to kill Custodes, not against devastating wounds, unfortunately. And for the most part, I'd argue that the stratagems are quite nice. There's things like reactive moves, fallback, shoot and charge, and +1 strength and AP at shooting, which is actually surprisingly savage with Custodes' firepower against light infantry. Many of them able to get a little bit of extra value, affecting another Sisters of Silent unit nearby if it's handy. For enhancements, you can just get some generically stronger characters. +1 to wound in melee is really good for a blade champion. I feel like perhaps the Aegis Projector is the single best one though. 20 points for changing a failed save to damage 0 for the bearer's unit each turn. That's pretty much guaranteed to get you more surviving custodians on the board, and I think is basically auto-include if you had the points and weren't taking anything else. Otherwise, for the codex detachments, the other major one is perhaps the shield host. The special rule for that one is martial mastery, giving you a big turn of melee damage. Sort of vaguely feels like the Custodes calling the war and then smashing down anything that gets in their way. Might just be a little bit irritating though if you're going second, so your opponent will be able to see this coming and potentially drop back a little bit that turn to mitigate a bit what you can destroy. Otherwise, they do have some defense against mortal wounds with a 1 CP stratagem, and options for a few other interesting things like fallback, shoot and charge, or making your Custodians more dangerous when they've taken casualties. The Castellan's Mark does seem like quite a fun enhancement as well for a shield captain, redeploying 2 Custodians units after determining who's had first turn. That's really quite a big ability for getting the jump on the opponent after you've got perfect knowledge of their deployment. Otherwise, for their detachments, the Auric Champions is the character-focused one. Pretty well everything supports them to the exclusion of anything else. You get +1 to wound against one nominated target with characters, a few stratagems to help them out. Though I feel like this one's probably going to be a niche one, given that you don't get support for your mainline damage dealer Custodia units. I feel like the characters will be very, very scary here, but perhaps only add so much. Finally, the Normaiden Vigil is the Sisters of Silence focused one. Their core rule is a battle shock related one, making the enemies more likely to test and more likely to fail. It's not unhelpful if you've got some within range of objective markers and you make them fail some tests while you've got some tanky units sat there. And beyond that, it has a few stratagems to amp up the damage of the Sisters of Silence units, though again, it's maybe not really to the extent where they can really carry the main damage of the army, and you still want a lot of Custodes in the list, I suspect, all of which won't be getting any support with core rules or stratagems. Probably one for a bit more for fun and fluffy type games, really. I feel like unless you absolutely know that you're fighting an entire army of psychers, they aren't going to do so well. Finally, here's just one example of what a somewhat competitive army list could look like for the Custodes. This one's building a force largely around 2 copies of the Combat Patrol box set, and then adding a few more choices in for support, and maybe isn't too far away for top competitive lists prior to the Codex release. This one's roughly 2,000 points, though it's not exact. Points will likely change throughout the edition anyway, so more of a rough idea as to what you could do. I'd be tempted to run this one in Talons of the Emperor, or maybe Shield Company as an alternative. This list is led by 3 characters, a Blade Champion, a Shield Captain with a Guardian Spear, and Trajan Valoris himself. Trajan Valoris and the Blade Champion will go with 2 big squads of Wardens with Spears and a Vexilla. They can add quite a lot of damage to their units, and they can be really tanky with their 4+ feel no pains and their -1 to wound. Then we've got 2 units of Custodian Guard, each with 3 Guardian Spears and 1 taking a Vexilla and Presidium Shield. There's going to be a Shield Captain in one of those, who I think there's enough points left over for an enhancement depending on the detachment, plus Kyria Draxus in another one, an allied agent of the Imperium Inquisitor who can help out with their shooting quite a lot. Otherwise, for this one I've gone kind of Terminator heavy, 2 units of 2 Alarus Custodians and 1 unit of 3. They can be nice for putting the smack down on some heavy hitters, plus their golden light redeploys can have them jump over the board and maybe get to places to do secondary objectives or threaten things that the opponents would normally have safe. And then to back up all of these scary golden boys marching up the board, there's a few small units of Sisters of Silence, 2 small units of 4 Prosecutors and 1 unit of 4 Witch Seekers to scout into the mid-board a little bit to do some screening. They can be handy just for grunt work, screening, or sitting on objectives if it will be safe for them to do so alone. The general game plan will be to have the thrust of the army march up the board, try and stick to cover where possible, and fight the enemy over the midfield, ideally coordinating with the Sisters of Silence to protect them against mortal wounds if they're playing in Talons of the Emperor. One of the units, either the Guard or the Wardens, might well deep strike, maybe think about rapid ingress to get some fairly guaranteed charges off, and the Alarus could strongly consider teleporting to just add a whole load of threats to one area of the board. plus using their grenade launchers to thin out hordes quite a lot better than some of the other units. Ideally, the Custodian Guard could get to the midfield, sit on an objective, and then get full wound rerolls. That could be particularly savage for Kyria Draxus's units, and particularly when she gets to double shoot. In any case, just one idea, not super optimized or anything like that, but maybe an example of a Custodes army list that you could play in-game. In any case, let me hear your thoughts on the Adeptus Custodes down in the comments. If you'd like to watch another video on the faction, I'll leave my full codex review video linked in the video description. Feel free to check that out next. And as I said, I hopefully will try and make some tier lists and army review videos in the future once we get the full points for the faction. If you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to have new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.